Hi, we're reading The Adventures of Captain Underpants, full color, the first epic novel by Dav Pilkey. Let's go. Chapter 1, George and Harold. Meet George Beard and Harold Hutchins. George is the kid on the left with the tie and the flat top. Harold is the one on the right with the t-shirt and the bad haircut. Remember that now. Flower shop, pick your own roses. George and Harold were best friends. They had a lot in common. They lived right next door to each other, and they were both in the same fourth grade class at Jerome Horowitz Elementary School. George and Harold were usually responsible kids. Whenever anything bad happened, George and Harold were usually responsible. Flower shop, pick our noses. But don't get the wrong idea about these two. George and Harold were actually very nice boys. No matter what everybody else thought, they were good, sweet, and lovable. Well, okay, maybe they weren't so sweet and lovable, but they were good nonetheless. It's just that George and Harold each had a silly streak a mile long. Usually that silly streak was hard to control. Sometimes it got them into trouble. And once it got them into big trouble. But before I can tell you that story, I have to tell you this story. Chapter 2, Treehouse Comics, Inc. After a hard day of cracking jokes, pulling pranks, and causing mayhem at school, George and Harold liked to rush to the old treehouse in George's backyard. Inside the treehouse were two big old fluffy chairs, a table, a cupboard crammed with junk food, and a padlocked crate filled with pencils, pens, and stacks of paper. Now Harold loved to draw, and George loved to make up stories, and together the two boys spent hours and hours writing and drawing their very own comic books. Over the years, they had created hundreds of their own comics, starring dozens of their own superheroes. First there was Dogman, then came Timmy the Talking Toilet, and who could forget the Amazing Cow Lady? But the all-time greatest superhero they had ever made up had to be the amazing Captain Underpants. George came up with the idea. Most superheroes look like they're flying around in their underwear, he said. Well, this guy actually is flying around in his underwear. The two boys laughed and laughed. Yeah, said Harold, he could fight with wedgie power. George and Harold spent entire afternoons writing and drawing the comic adventures of Captain Underpants. He was their coolest superhero ever. Luckily for the boys, the secretary at Jerome Horowitz Elementary School was much too busy to keep an eye on the copy machine. So whenever they got a chance, George and Harold would sneak into the office and run off several hundred copies of their latest Captain Underpants adventure. After school, they sold their homemade comics on the playground for 50 cents each. Chapter 3, The Adventures of Captain Underpants, written by George Beard, cartoons by Harold Hutchins. The Really Cool Adventures of Captain Underpants, written by George Beard, drawn by Harold Hutchins. It was a time of darkness and despair for planet Earth. Bad guys had taken over the streets, and all of the superheroes in the world were too old to fight evil. Hey, aha. Then along came a new, improved, extra-strength superhero. Tra-la-la! Look, up in the sky! It's a bird! It's a plane! It's an egg salad sandwich! No way! I'm Captain Underpants! Captain Underpants was faster than a speeding waistband. Zoom! More powerful than boxer shorts, and able to leap tall buildings without getting a wedgie. Tra-la-la! Night and day, Captain Underpants watched over the city, fighting for truth, justice, and all that is pre-shrunk and cottony. Meanwhile, at a nearby elementary school, turn the page. It was Stinky Taco Surprise Day at the cafeteria. Yuck. Everybody hated it so much they all threw it away. Trash. Soon the cafeteria food came to life. I am the inedible Hulk! The monster ran around the school eating everything in sight. Munch. Help! The inedible hunk just ate up 15 folding chairs and the gym teacher! Oh no, not the folding chairs! This is the principal. This looks like a job for tra-la-la, Captain Underpants! Captain Underpants shot lots of underwear at the monster, but it didn't do any good. Zip, munch, munch. Captain Underpants took off running. The inedible hunk chased him. Grrr! Help! And chased him and chased him. Finally, the inedible hunk got too tired and thirsty to chase Captain Underpants. How about a nice drink of water? Boys' bathroom. So the monster took a long drink from the shiny white bowl. Gulp, gulp. When suddenly, flush. Hooray for Captain Underpants! And so the inedible hunk got flushed away and was never heard from again. Tra-la-la! The end. Don't miss our next existing adventure, Captain Underpants and the Attack of the Talking Toilets, coming soon to a playground near you. Chapter 4. Mean Old Mr. KRUPP. Do you see that old guy looking out the window up there? That's Mr. KRUPP, the principal. Now, Mr. KRUPP was the meanest, sourest old principal in the whole history of Jerome Horowitz Elementary School. He hated laughing and singing. He hated the sound of children playing at recess. In fact, he hated children altogether. And guess which two children Mr. KRUPP hated most of all? If you guessed George and Harold, you're right. Mr. KRUPP hated George and Harold. He hated their pranks and their wisecracks. He hated their silly attitudes and their constant giggling. And he especially hated those awful Captain Underpants comic books. I'm gonna get those boys one day, Mr. KRUPP vowed. One day, very, very soon. Kneel here. Chapter 5. One day, very, very soon. Remember when I said that George and Harold's silly streak got them into big, big trouble once? Well, this is the story of how that happened, and how some huge pranks and a little blackmail turned their principal into the coolest superhero of all time. It was the day of the big football game between the Horowitz Knuckleheads and the Steubenville Stinkbugs. The bleachers were filled with fans. Jerome Horowitz Elementary. See our big football game today. The cheerleaders ran onto the field and shook their pom-poms over their heads. A fine black dust drifted out of their pom-poms and settled all around them. Give me a K, shouted the cheerleaders. K, repeated the fans. Give me an N, shouted the cheerleaders. N, repeated the fans. Give me a chew, sneezed the cheerleaders. Chew, repeated the fans. The cheerleaders sneezed and sneezed some more. They couldn't stop sneezing. Hey, shouted a fan in the bleachers. Somebody sprinkled black pepper into the cheerleaders' pom-poms. I wonder who did that, asked another fan. The cheerleaders stumbled off the field, sneezing and dripping with mucus, as the marching band members took their places. But when the band began to play, steady streams of bubbles began blowing out of their instruments. Bubbles were everywhere. Up and down the field, the marching band slipped and slid, leaving behind a thick trail of wet, bubbly foam. Hey, shouted a fan in the bleachers. Somebody poured bubble bath into the marching band's instruments. I wonder who did that? Asked another fan. Soon the football teams took the field. The knuckleheads kicked the ball. Up, up, up went the ball. Higher and higher it went. The ball sailed into the clouds and kept right on going until nobody could see it any more. Hey! Shouted a fan in the bleachers. Somebody filled the game ball with helium. I wonder who did that? Asked another fan. But the missing ball didn't make any difference because at that moment the knuckleheads were rolling around the field, scratching and itching like crazy. Hey! Shouted the coach. Somebody replaced our deep heating muscle rub lotion with Mr. Prankster's extra scratchy itching cream. We wonder who did that! Shouted the fans in the bleachers. The whole afternoon went on much the same way, with people shouting everything from, "Hey, somebody put sea monkeys in the lemonade," to, "Hey, somebody glued all the bathroom doors shut." Before long, most of the fans in the bleachers had gotten up and left. The big game had been forfeited, and everyone in the entire school was miserable. Jerome Horowitz Elementary. Boy, our feet smell bad. Everyone, that is, except for two giggling boys crouching in the shadows beneath the bleachers. Those were our best pranks yet, laughed Harold. Yep, chuckled George. They'll be hard to top, that's for sure. I just hope we don't get busted for this, said Harold. Don't worry, said George. We covered our tracks really well. There's no way we'll get busted. Chapter 6. Busted. The next day at school, an announcement came over the loudspeakers. George Beard and Harold Hutchins, please report to Principal KRUPP's office at once. Uh-oh, said Harold. I don't like the sound of that. Don't worry, said George. They can't prove anything. George and Harold entered Principal KRUPP's office and sat down on the chairs in front of his desk. The two boys had been in this office together countless times before, but this time was different. Mr. KRUPP was smiling. As long as George and Harold had known Mr. KRUPP, they had never ever seen him smile. Mr. KRUPP knew something. I didn't see you guys at the big game yesterday, said Mr. KRUPP. Oh no, said George. We weren't feeling well. Yeah, Harold stammered nervously. We went home. Oh, that's too bad, said Principal KRUPP. You boys missed a good game. George and Harold quickly glanced at each other, gulped, and tried hard not to look guilty. Lucky for you, I have a videotape of the whole thing, Mr. KRUPP said. He turned on the television in the corner and pressed the play button on the VCR. A black and white image appeared on the TV screen. It was an overhead shot of George and Harold sprinkling pepper into the cheerleaders' pom-poms. Next came a shot of George and Harold pouring liquid bubble bath into the marching band's instruments. How do you like the pre-game show? Asked Mr. KRUPP with a devilish grin. George eyed the television screen in terror. He couldn't answer. Harold's eyes were glued to the floor. He couldn't look. The tape went on and on, revealing all of George and Harold's behind-the-scenes antics. By now, both boys were eyeing the floor, squirming nervously and dripping with sweat. Mr. KRUPP turned off the TV. You know, he said, ever since you boys came to this school, it's been one prank after another. First, you put dissected frogs in the Jell-O salad at the parent-teacher banquet. Then you made it snow in the cafeteria. Then you rigged all the intercoms so they played Weird Al Yankovic songs full blast for 6 hours straight. For 4 long years, you two have been running amok in this school, and I've never been able to prove anything until now. Mr. KRUPP held the videotape in his hand. I took the liberty of installing tiny video surveillance cameras all around the school. I knew I'd catch you two in the act one day. I just didn't know it would be so easy. Chapter 7. A Little Blackmail. Mr. Krupp sat back in his chair and chuckled to himself for a long, long time. Finally, George got up the courage to speak. What are you going to do with that tape? He said. I thought you'd never ask, laughed Principal Krupp. I've thought long and hard about what to do with this tape, Mr. Krupp said. At first, I thought I'd send a copy to your parents. The boys swallowed hard and sank deeply into their chairs. Then I thought I might send a copy to the school board, Mr. Krupp continued. I could get you both expelled for this. The boys swallowed harder and sank deeper into their chairs. Finally, I came to a decision, Mr. Krupp concluded. I think the football team would be very curious to find out just who was responsible for yesterday's fiasco. I think I'll send a copy to them. George and Harold leaped out of their chairs and fell to their knees. No! Cried George. You can't do that. They'll kill us. Yeah, begged Harold. They'll kill us every day for the rest of our lives. Mr. Krupp laughed and laughed. Please have mercy, the boys cried. We'll do anything. Anything? Asked Principal Krupp with delight. He reached into his desk, pulled out a list of demands, and tossed it at the boys. If you don't want to be dead as long as you live, you'll follow these rules exactly. Rules. Kneel here. George and Harold carefully looked over the list. This is blackmail, said George. Call it what you like, Principal Krupp snapped. But if you two don't follow that list exactly, then this tape becomes the property of Horowitz knuckleheads. Rules. Number 1. No more practical jokes or pranks. Number 2. No laughing or smiling. Number 3. No more something. 4. No more Captain Underpants. 5. Wash my car every. Number 6. Mow my. Can't really see all the rules. Chapter 8. Crime and Punishment. At 6 o'clock the next morning, George and Harold dragged themselves out of bed, walked over to Mr. Krupp's house, and began washing his car. Then, while Harold scrubbed the tires, George roamed around the yard, pulling up all the weeds and crabgrass he could find. Afterward, they cleaned the gutters and washed all the windows on Mr. Krupp's house. At school, George and Harold sat up straight, listened carefully, and spoke only when spoken to. They didn't tell jokes, they didn't pull pranks, they didn't even smile. Their teacher kept pinching herself. I just know this is a dream, she said. At lunch, the two boys vacuumed Mr. Krupp's office, shined his shoes, and polished his desktop. At recess, they clipped his fingernails and ironed his tie. Each spare moment in the boys' daily schedule was spent catering to Mr. Krupp's every whim. After school, George and Harold mowed Mr. Krupp's lawn, tended his garden, and began painting the front of his house. At sunset, Mr. Krupp came outside and handed each boy a stack of books. Gentlemen, he said, I've asked your teachers to give you both extra homework. Now go home, study hard, and I'll see you back here at 6 o'clock tomorrow morning. We've got a busy day ahead of us. Thank you, sir, moaned the two boys. George and Harold walked home dead tired. Man, this was the worst day of my entire life, said George. Don't worry, said Harold. We only have to do this for 8 more years. Then we can move away to some far-off land where they'll never find us. Maybe Antarctica. I've got a better idea, said George. He took a piece of paper out of his pocket and handed it to Harold. It was an old magazine ad for the 3D hypno ring. How's this going to help us? Asked Harold. All we got to do is hypnotize Mr. Krupp, said George. We'll make him give us the video and forget this whole mess ever happened." "That's a great idea," said Harold. "And the best part is we only have to wait 4 to 6 weeks for delivery." Chapter 9, 4 to 6 weeks later. After 4 to 6 weeks of back-breaking labor, grueling homework assignments, and humiliating good behavior at school, a package arrived in George's mailbox from the Little Wise Guy Novelty Company. It was the 3D Hypno Ring. "Hallelujah!" cried George. "It's everything I ever hoped for." "Let me see it, let me see it," said Harold. "Don't look directly at it," warned George. "You don't want to get hypnotized, do you?" "Do you really think it will work?" asked Harold. "Do you really think we can amaze our friends, control our enemies, and rule the world just like the ad says?" "It better work," said George, "or else we just wasted 4 whole bucks." Chapter 10, The 3D Hypno Ring. The next morning, George and Harold didn't arrive early at Mr. KRUPP's house to wash his car and reshingle his roof. In fact, they were even a little late getting to school. When they finally showed up, Mr. KRUPP was standing at the front door waiting for them. And boy, was he mad. Mr. KRUPP escorted the boys into his office and slammed the door. "All right, where were you two this morning?" he growled. "We wanted to come over to your house," said George, "but we were busy trying to figure out the secret of this ring." "What ring?" snapped Mr. KRUPP. George held up his hand and showed the ring to Principal KRUPP. "It's got one of these weird patterns on it," said Harold. "If you stare at it long enough, a picture appears." "Well, hold it still," snarled Mr. KRUPP. "I can't see the darn thing." "I have to move it back and forth," said George, "or else it won't work." Mr. KRUPP's eyes followed the ring back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, and back and forth. "You have to stare deeper into the ring," said Harold. "Deeper, deeper, deeper, deeper." "You are getting sleepy," said George. "Very sleepy." Mr. KRUPP's eyelids began to droop. "I'm so sleepy," he mumbled. After a few minutes, Mr. KRUPP's eyes were closed tight and he began to snore. "You are under our spell," said George. "When I snap my fingers, you will obey our every command." Snap. "I will obey," mumbled Mr. KRUPP. "All right," said George. "Have you still got that videotape of me and Harold?" "Yes," mumbled Mr. KRUPP. "Well, hand it over, bub," George instructed. Mr. KRUPP unlocked a large file cabinet and opened the bottom drawer. He reached in and handed George the videotape. George stuffed it into his backpack. Harold took a different video out of his backpack and put it into the file cabinet. "What's that video?" asked George. "It's one of my little sister's old Boomer the Purple Dragon sing-along videos." "Nice touch," said George. Chapter 11, Fun with Hypnosis. When Harold bent down to close the file cabinet, he took a quick look inside. "Whoa!" he cried. "Look at all that stuff in here." The file cabinet was filled with everything Mr. KRUPP had taken away from the boys over the years. There were slingshots, whoopee cushions, skateboards, fake doggy doo-doo, you name it, it was in there. "Look at this!" cried George. "A big stack of Captain Underpants comics." "He got every issue," said Harold. For hours the two boys sat on the floor laughing and reading their comics. Finally George looked up at the clock. "Yikes," he said, "it's almost lunchtime. We better clean up this mess and get to class." The boys looked up at their principal, who had been standing behind them in a trance all morning. "Gee, I almost forgot about Mr. KRUPP," said Harold. "What should we do with him?" Do you want to have some fun? Asked George. Why not? Said Harold. I haven't had any fun in the last 4 to 6 weeks. Cool, said George. He walked up to Mr. Krupp and snapped his fingers. Snap. You are a chicken, he said. Suddenly Mr. Krupp leaped onto his desk and flapped his arms. Cluck, 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 he cried, kicking his papers off the desk behind him and pecking at his pen and pencil set. George and Harold howled with laughter. Let me try, said Harold. You are a monkey. You gotta snap your fingers, said George. Oh yeah, said Harold. Snap. You are a monkey. Suddenly Mr. Krupp sprang off his desk and began swinging from the fluorescent light fixtures. Ooh, 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 ah! He shrieked, leaping from one side of the room to the other. George and Harold laughed so hard they almost cried. My turn, said George. Let's see, what should we turn him into next? I know, Harold said, holding up a Captain Underpants comic. Let's turn him into Captain Underpants. Good idea, said George. Snap! You are now the greatest superhero of all time, the amazing Captain Underpants. Mr. Krupp tore down the red curtain from his office window and tied it around his neck. Then he took off his shoes, socks, shirt, pants, and his awful toupee. Tra-la-la, he sang. Mr. Krupp stood before them looking quite triumphant, with his cape blowing in the breeze of the open window. George and Harold were dumbfounded. You know, said George, he kind of looks like Captain Underpants. Yeah, Harold replied. After a short silence, the two boys looked at each other and burst into laughter. George and Harold had never laughed so hard in all their lives. Tears ran down their faces as they rolled about the floor, shrieking in hysterics. After a while, George pulled himself up from the floor for another look. Hey! George cried. Where'd he go? Chapter 12. Out the Window. George and Harold dashed to the window and looked out. There, running across the parking lot, was a pudgy old guy in his underwear with a red cape flowing behind him. Tra-la-la! Mr. Krupp, come back! Shouted Harold. He won't answer to that, said George. He thinks he's Captain Underpants now. Oh no, said Harold. He's probably running off to fight crime, said George. Oh no, said Harold. And we gotta stop him, said George. Oh no, cried Harold. No way! Look, said George, he could get killed out there. Harold was unmoved. Or worse, said George. We could get into big trouble. You're right, said Harold. We gotta go after him. The two boys opened the bottom file cabinet drawer and took out their slingshots and skateboards. Do you think we should bring anything else? Asked Harold. Yeah, said George. Let's bring the fake doggy doo-doo. Good thinking, said Harold. You just never know when fake doggy doo-doo is going to come in handy. Harold stuffed Mr. Krupp's clothes, shoes, and toupee into his backpack. Then together the two boys leaped out the window, slid down the flagpole, and took off on their skateboards after the amazing Captain Underpants. Chapter 13. Bank Robbers. George and Harold rode their skateboards all over town looking for Captain Underpants. I can't find him anywhere, said Harold. You'd think a guy like him would be easy to spot, said George. Then the boys turned a corner, and there he was. Captain Underpants was standing in front of a bank, looking quite heroic. Mr. Krupp! Cried Harold. Shh! Said George. Don't call him that. Call him Captain Underpants. Oh, yeah, said Harold. And don't forget to snap your fingers, said George. Right, said Harold. But before he got a chance, the bank doors flew wide open and out stepped two robbers. The robbers took one look at Captain Underpants and stopped dead in their tracks. Surrender, said Captain Underpants, or I will have to resort to wedgie power. Oh no, whispered George and Harold. Ring! The alarm. Frank's bank. Nobody moved for about 10 seconds. Finally, the robbers looked at each other and burst out laughing. They dropped their loot and fell to the sidewalk, screaming in hysterics. Almost immediately, the cops showed up and arrested the crooks. "Let that be a lesson to you," cried Captain Underpants. "Never underestimate the power of underwear." The police chief, looking quite angry, marched over to Captain Underpants. "And just who the heck are you supposed to be?" the police chief demanded. "Why, I'm Captain Underpants, the world's greatest superhero," said Captain Underpants. "I fight for truth, justice, and all that is pre-shrunk and cottony." "Oh, yeah?" shouted the police chief. "Cuff 'em, boys!" One of the cops took out his handcuffs and grabbed Captain Underpants by the arm. "Uh-oh," cried George. "We gotta roll!" Together the two boys zoomed into the crowd, weaving in and out of the cops and bystanders. Harold skated up to Captain Underpants and knocked the superhero off his feet. George caught him, and the boys skated away with Captain Underpants on their shoulders. "Stop!" cried the cops, but it was too late. George, Harold, and Captain Underpants were gone. Chapter 14. The Big Bang. After their quick escape, George, Harold, and Captain Underpants stopped on a deserted street corner to catch their breath. "Okay," said George, "let's dehypnotize him quick before something else happens." Kaboom! A huge explosion came from the rare crystal shop across the street. Heavy smoke poured out of the building. Suddenly, two robots with one stolen crystal emerged from the smoke and jumped into an old truck. "Did I just see two robots get into a truck?" asked Harold. "You know," said George, "up until now, this story was almost believable." "Well, believable or not," said Harold, "we're not getting involved. I repeat, we are not getting involved." Just then, Captain Underpants leaped from the street corner and dashed in front of the truck. "Stop, in the name of underwear!" he cried. "Uh-oh," said George, "I think we're involved." The two robots started up the truck and swerved around Captain Underpants. Unfortunately, the truck brushed up against his red cape and it got caught. With a mighty jerk, Captain Underpants flipped backward and the truck pulled him along as it drove away. The bad guys. "Grab him!" cried George. The two boys skateboarded with all their might across toward the speeding truck and grabbed Captain Underpants by the ankles. "Help!" they cried as the truck pulled them through the city streets. "Mommy," said a little boy sitting on a bench, "I just saw two robots driving a truck with a guy in his underwear hanging off the back by a red cape, pulling two boys on a skateboard behind him with his feet." "How do you expect me to believe such a ridiculous story?" asked his mother. Bus stop. Tabloid Times. Bigfoot gives birth to 200-pound UFO baby. Finally, the truck came to a screeching halt in front of an old abandoned warehouse. The sudden stop made Captain Underpants flip over the roof of the truck and crash through the front door of the building. "Well, well, well," said a strange voice from inside the warehouse. "It looks as if we have a visitor." Chapter 15. Dr. Diaper. George and Harold hid behind the truck until the coast was clear. Then they sneaked up to the hole in the door and peeked inside. Captain Underpants was all tied up. The two robots were standing guard, and a strange little man wearing a diaper was laughing maniacally. "I am the evil Dr. Diaper," the strange little old man told Captain Underpants. "And you will be the first to witness my takeover of the world." Dr. Diver placed the stolen crystal into a large machine called the Laser-Matic 2000. The machine started to light up and make loud noises. Heavy gears began shifting and spinning, and a laser beam from a crystal shot straight up through a hole in the roof. In exactly 20 minutes, this laser beam will blow up the moon and send huge chunks of it crashing down upon every major city in the world, laughed Dr. Diaper. Then I will rise from the rubble and take over the planet. Only one thing can help us now, said George. What? Asked Harold. Rubber doggy doo-doo, said George. Harold took the fake doggy doo-doo and the slingshot from George's backpack and handed them to him. Be careful, said Harold. The fate of the entire planet is in your hands. With careful and precise aim, George shot the rubber doo-doo through the air and across the room. It landed with a plop right at the feet of Dr. Diaper. Yes, whispered George and Harold. Plop. Dr. Diaper looked down at the doo-doo between his feet and turned bright red. Oh, dear me, he cried. I'm dreadfully embarrassed. Please excuse me. He began to waddle toward the restroom. This has never happened to me before, I assure you, he said. I guess with all the excitement, oh dear, oh dear. While Dr. Diaper was off changing himself, George and Harold sneaked into the old warehouse. Immediately the robots detected the boys and began marching toward them. Destroy the intruders, said the robots. Destroy the intruders! George and Harold screamed and ran to the back of the warehouse. Luckily, George found 2 old boards and gave one of them to Harold. We're not going to have to resort to incredibly graphic violence, are we? Asked Harold. I sure hope not, said George. Chapter 16, The Incredibly Graphic Violence Chapter, in FLIP-E-RAMA. Warning: the following chapter contains graphic scenes showing 2 boys beating the tar out of a couple of robots. If you have high blood pressure or if you faint at the sight of motor oil, we strongly urge you to take better care of yourself and stop being such a baby. Introducing FLIP-E-RAMA! As everybody knows, nothing enhances silly action sequences more than really cheesy animation. And so, for the first time in history of great literature, we proudly bring you the latest in cheesy animation technology, the art of FLIP-E-RAMA. Alright guys, this is better with an actual book. It's harder on the screen. Okay, robot rampage, robot rampage. Yeah, it's not going to work so well on here. George saves Harold. Harold returns the favor. In the book, you can flip between the 2 pages. Mixed nuts and bolts. Chapter 17, The Escape. After defeating the robots, George and Harold untied Captain Underpants. Come on, cried Harold. Let's get out of here. Wait, said Captain Underpants. We have to save the world first. So George, Harold, and Captain Underpants frantically looked all over the Lasermatic 2000, searching for a way to shut it down and stop the inevitable disaster. Said Harold, I think this might be the lever we want. He pulled the self-destruct lever with all his might. Suddenly, the Lasermatic 2000 began to sputter and shake. The huge laser beam turned off and pieces of the machine began flying off in all directions. It's gonna blow! Cried Harold. Run for your lives! Not so fast, screamed Dr. Diaper, who had appeared out of nowhere. You demolished my robots, you destroyed my Lasermatic 2000, and you ruined my one chance to take over the world! But you won't live to tell the tale. Dr. Diaper pulled out his Diapermatic 2000 ray gun and pointed it at George, Harold, and Captain Underpants. Stretch. Captain Underpants quickly stretched a pair of underwear and shot it at Dr. Diaper. The underwear landed right on the evil doctor's head. "Help!" cried Dr. Diaper. "I can't see! I can't see!" Snap. George and Harold ran out of the warehouse as fast as they could. "Great shot, Captain Underpants!" cried Harold. "There's just one thing I don't understand," said George. "Where did you get that extra pair of underwear?" "What extra pair?" said Captain Underpants. "Wah!" "Never mind that," cried George. "Let's just get out of here before that Lasermatic 2000 thing Kaboom! Explodes." The Lasermatic 2000 blew up, tearing apart the old warehouse. It sent flaming shards of red-hot metal in every direction. Fire fell from the skies around our heroes, and the earth began to crumble beneath their feet. "Oh no!" cried Harold. "We're doomed!" Boom! Chapter 18. To make a long story short, they got away. Chapter 19. Back to school. George, Harold, and Captain Underpants made a quick stop outside the police station. They tied Dr. Diaper to a lamppost and attached a note to him. "There," said Captain Underpants. "That ought to explain everything." "Arrest me." Police station. Back in 15 minutes. Please don't commit any crimes till we return. Thank you. Then George and Harold led Captain Underpants back to Jerome Horowitz Elementary School. Where are we going here?" asked Captain Underpants. "Well," said George, "you have to do some undercover work here." "Yeah," said Harold, reaching into his backpack. "Put these clothes on and make it snappy." "Don't forget your hair," said George. Captain Underpants quickly got dressed behind some bushes. "Well, how do I look?" he asked. "Pretty good," said George. "Now try to look really mad." Captain Underpants made the nastiest face he could. "You know," said Harold, "he kind of looks like Mr. KRUPP." "Harold," whispered George, "he is Mr. KRUPP." "Oh, yeah," said Harold. "I almost forgot." Before long they were all back inside Mr. KRUPP's office. "Okay, Captain Underpants," said George, "you are now Mr. KRUPP." "Snap your fingers," whispered Harold. "Oh, yeah," said George. "Snap! You are now Mr. KRUPP." "Who's Mr. KRUPP?" asked Captain Underpants. "Oh, no!" cried Harold. "It's not working!" The boys tried again and again to dehypnotize Captain Underpants, but nothing seemed to work. Said Harold. "Let me see the instruction manual for that ring." George checked his pants pockets. Said George, "I think I lost it." "You what?" cried Harold. The two boys searched frantically through the office, but the 3D Hypno Ring instruction manual was nowhere to be found. "Never mind," said George. "I have an idea." He removed the flowers from a large vase in the corner. Then he poured out all the water over Captain Underpants' head. "What did you do that for?" cried Harold. "I saw him do this in a cartoon once," said George. "So it's gotta work." After a few minutes, Mr. KRUPP slowly came to. "What's going on here?" he demanded. "And why am I all wet?" George and Harold had never been so glad to see Mr. KRUPP in all their lives. "I'm so happy I could cry," said Harold. "Well, you're gonna cry when I give that videotape to the football team," shouted Mr. KRUPP. "I've had it with you two." Principal KRUPP took the videotape out of his file cabinet. "You boys are dead meat," he sneered. He stormed out of his office with the video and headed toward the gym. George and Harold smiled. "Wait till the football team sees that video," said Harold. "Yeah," said George. "I sure hope they like singing Purple Dragons." "Hey, look," said George. "I found the 3D Hypno Ring instruction manual. It was in my shirt pocket, not my pants pocket." Well, throw that thing away, said Harold. We'll never need it again. I sure hope not, said George. Chapter 20. The End? Things at Jerome Horowitz Elementary School were never quite the same after that fateful day. The football team enjoyed Mr. KRUPP's video so much that they changed their name from the Knuckleheads to the Purple Dragon Sing-Along Friends. The name change didn't go over too well with the fans, but hey, who's going to argue with a bunch of linebackers? La la la, we love Boomer, la la. George and Harold went back to their old ways, pulling pranks, cracking jokes, and making new comic books. They had to keep an eye on Mr. KRUPP, though. Snap, snap, because for some strange reason, every time he heard the sound of fingers snapping, snap, Principal KRUPP turned back into you-know-who. Oh no, cried Harold. Here we go again, said George. Tra-la-la! Well, friends, that was the story of Captain Underpants. And now we will read the origin of Captain Underpants. This is a little backstory about how Dav Pilkey started the book. Dav Pilkey created Captain Underpants when he was 8 years old. It all happened back in 1974 when Dave was a second grader at St. John's Lutheran School in Elyria, Ohio. It might not surprise you to know that Dav Pilkey was the class clown back in the second grade. He was also the class artist. Whenever Dave got a chance, he would draw funny pictures to make his friends laugh. Dave also folded sheets of paper in half to make his own FLIP-E-RAMAs, which depicted ridiculous scenes of mayhem. He and his friends called them flip actions back then. Like George and Harold, Dav Pilkey even made his own original comic books. All of these things were seen as great distractions and annoyances by Dave's cantankerous teacher, Miss Ribble. Not her real name. It was this very teacher, however, who inadvertently gave Dave the idea for Captain Underpants. One day Miss Ribble was talking to the class and she happened to use the word underwear. Everyone in Dave's class immediately began to laugh. This irritated Dave's teacher and she got very angry. She scolded the children, shouting, "Underwear is not funny!" This only made the class laugh even harder. At that moment, Dav Pilkey had an epiphany. He realized that underwear was a very powerful thing. Just the mere mention of it could make everyone laugh. That day, Dav Pilkey drew his very first drawing of the caped hero named Captain Underpants. Dave's drawing was an immediate hit with his classmates. Miss Ribble, however, was not amused. She immediately tore up Dave's drawing and sent him out into the hallway. Zong! Dav Pilkey was no stranger to spending time in the hallway. In the second grade, Dave got banished to the hallway almost every day. Usually he spent his time sneaking up and down the corridors, changing the letters on all of the bulletin boards around, so they spelled out, "Mr. Pilkey out! Catch a fart!" So they spelled out ridiculous things. It wasn't long before Miss Ribble got wise to Dave's hallway shenanigans and moved a spare desk out there so he would stay put. Usually Dave just drew silly pictures while he sat at his hallway desk. But on the day of Dave's great epiphany, he was inspired. He began making a comic book about his underwear-clad hero. Captain Underpants flew into action on the pages of Dave's story, defeating terrible monsters, rescuing innocent children, and saving the world in a crazy flip-action scenes. When Dave was finally allowed back into the classroom, he brought his comic book in with him. It didn't take long before Captain Underpants' first adventure began causing outbursts of laughter and hysteria. Miss Ribble seized Dave's comic, ripped it up, and told him he'd better straighten up. "You can't spend the rest of your life making silly books," she told him. Despite his teacher's admonishments, Dave Pilkey did indeed continue making silly books. In fact, Dave got his very first silly book published when he was still in college. After he graduated, Dave wrote and illustrated many more silly books about dogs, cats, mice, dragons, and dumb bunnies. When he wasn't making books, Dave visited hundreds of schools and libraries and talked with children about his experience as an author. Every time Dave spoke, he would draw a giant picture of Captain Underpants, which made the children laugh hysterically. At the end of his presentations, kids would always ask Dave the same question. Are you ever going to make a book about Captain Underpants? I don't know, Dave would reply. Do you think I should? The answer was always a resounding, roof-raising scream of, Yes! So in 1996, Dav Pilkey began writing and drawing the book you are now holding in your hands, or you're holding in your hands right now. Dave wanted to include as much of his own childhood as possible in the book, so he based George and Harold on himself. Like Dave, George and Harold are class clowns and class artists. They make comics, they switch letters around on signs, and they are always getting in trouble with their teachers and principal for one thing or another. And of course, their action scenes are always presented in FLIP-E-RAMA. Fun facts. Fun fact number 1. George and Harold got their names from two famous children's books that Dav Pilkey loved as a child, Curious George and Harold and the Purple Crayon. Fun fact number 2. George and Harold's last names, Beard and Hutchins, were the last names of two child actors who appeared in Hal Roach's Our Gang comedies, also known as The Little Rascals. Dave watched that show every day when he was a kid, and his two favorite characters, Weezer and Stymie, were portrayed by child actors Bobby Hutchins and Matthew Beard. Fun fact number 3. Mr. KRUPP's last name was also taken from Our Gang Little Rascals character. Sort of. The 1934 short film Shrimps for a Day featured an evil, grouchy old man who made quite an impression on Dave when he was a kid. The character's name in the film was Mr. Crutch, but Dave remembered it incorrectly, instead giving Captain Underpants' alter ego the moniker Mr. KRUPP. If Dav Pilkey's memory had been better, Mr. KRUPP would have been called Mr. Crutch. Fun fact number 4. Jerome Horowitz Elementary School was named after Curly, one of the Three Stooges, another show Dav Pilkey watched every day as a child. Curly's real name was Jerome Horowitz. Fun fact number 5. Dav Pilkey not only writes all of the Captain Underpants stories, he also does all of the illustrations, including the paintings on the covers. It takes Dave about 6 months to write each book, and another 6 months to draw and paint every picture. Fun fact number 6. Dave creates the interior illustrations with pencil and gray watercolors and paints each book cover with gouache and acrylics. For the color editions, the interior art is sent to a team of colorists who color the art digitally. All right, friends, we hope you've enjoyed reading Captain Underpants today. We've got lots of other books to come. And if you haven't yet, please subscribe. Please like the video. Please share it with your friends. Thank you so much for listening. Bye.